You know, when you think of an airline going bust, you usually picture angry customers, terrible service, and empty planes, right? Well, the story of GOL Airlines in Brazil is something else entirely. This wasn't a tale of losing customers. It was a story of losing control thanks to a perfect storm of crises that had almost nothing to do with them. Today, we're unpacking how this low-cost pioneer flew straight into that storm and had to file for bankruptcy to survive.
And that really brings us to the core question of this whole story. What happens when the very thing that makes you strong, your greatest asset, suddenly becomes your biggest liability? For GOL, the lean, efficient model that made it a powerhouse also made it incredibly vulnerable. Okay, so before we get to the crash, we have to talk about the takeoff. To really get GOL's downfall, you have to understand its absolutely revolutionary rise. When it launched back in 2000, it brought a totally new way of flying to Brazil. And get this, in less than 20 years, it was single-handedly responsible for tripling the number of people flying inside the country.
GOL's big idea was to be what's called a low-cost carrier, or LCC. The philosophy is simple, really. You slash every possible cost you can find so you can offer rock-bottom fares. And in Brazil, this was a revolution. It literally opened up the skies to millions of people who had never been able to afford a plane ticket before. So how'd they pull it off? By following the classic LCC playbook. Now, one of these strategies is absolutely crucial to our story today, the idea of using a single aircraft family. For GOL, that meant flying only Boeing 737s. Think about it, that simplifies everything. Your pilots only need to know one plane, your mechanics only need parts for one plane, it cuts costs like crazy. They also skipped the expensive central hubs and just focused on getting passengers from point A to point B, keeping their planes in the air as much as humanly possible.
And you can really see the results here. This chart shows block hours, which is basically just the time a plane is pushing back from the gate to the time it arrives at the next one. It's the time the plane is working and making money. LCCs like GOL, they're flying for over 12 hours a day. That's 50% more than a traditional airline. More time in the air simply means more money coming in.
GOL's model was this incredibly efficient, well-oiled machine. But then, the first major shockwave hit, and it struck right at the heart of their single-fleet strategy.
And this is where the story pivots. It's so important to understand this. The crisis that started GOL's spiral wasn't about its service or its prices. The problem was the very asset its entire business was built on. The airplanes themselves.
See, GOL was completely all in on the Boeing 737, and they were putting a huge bet on the brand new 737 MAX. This plane was supposed to be a total game changer. It promised a massive 15% jump in fuel efficiency and had the range to open up 40 new international routes. It was literally the key to their entire future.
But the MAX had a hidden, tragic flaw. A small piece of flight control software called MCAS, which pilots weren't even fully trained on, was blamed for 2 horrific fatal crashes. So in March of 2019, aviation authorities across the globe did the unthinkable. They grounded the entire 737 MAX fleet. For GOL, this was a disaster. Their shiny new planes, the future of their airline, were suddenly just very expensive lawn ornaments.
Now, a grounded fleet is bad, really bad, but GOL was still holding on. And then the perfect storm truly hit. These second and third massive waves crashed down almost at the same time. A global pandemic that made travel demand just vanish, and a currency crisis that went straight for the jugular of their balance sheet.
The COVID-19 pandemic was just devastating. Travel ground to a complete halt. And for an airline like GOL, where over 90% of its income came from people buying tickets, the result was a staggering 55% drop in passenger revenue in one single year. It's almost impossible to survive that. Now here's where it gets even tougher. While airlines in the US got a massive $60 billion bailout from the government to help them survive, Brazilian airlines like GOL were pretty much left on their own. There was no big government rescue package. They had to absorb that entire financial shock by themselves.
And at the exact same time, another fire was starting, this one deep inside their financial reports. Here's the trap. GAL earned all its money in the local currency, the Brazilian real. But
A huge chunk of its costs, we're talking 40% for things like jet fuel and leasing those planes, had to be paid in US dollars. And then, in 2020, the Brazilian real just collapsed. It lost almost 30% of its value against the dollar. So, imagine this. Just as your income is falling off a cliff, your biggest bills suddenly become 30% more expensive, practically overnight. It's a complete financial nightmare.
So, facing this unbelievable triple whammy, GOL didn't just give up. For 2 years, the company fought like hell, trying everything they could to restructure their finances and stay out of a formal bankruptcy court.
They pulled off some really complex financial maneuvers. First, they converted a bunch of overdue payments for their planes into new long-term debt, basically kicking the can down the road. Then they orchestrated this major deal with a holding company called Abra to swap old debt and get a much-needed injection of cash. But these were just Band-Aids. The financial bleeding was just too severe.
By the end of 2023, the writing was on the wall. An out-of-court fix wasn't going to work. The only path left was bankruptcy. Which leads to a really fascinating strategic question. With its own laws available in Brazil, why go all the way to the United States to file?
Well, the answer comes down to one word: predictability. U.S. Chapter 11 law offered a clear, reliable process that the Brazilian system just couldn't match. 3 things really stand out. First, a strict, absolute priority rule. This basically means there's a clear pecking order. Creditors get paid before owners, period. Second, creditors can propose their own rescue plans if they don't like the company's. And third, and maybe most important, is something called DIP financing. This lets the company get new loans to keep operating, and those new lenders are guaranteed to be first in line to get paid back. For GOL's international creditors, that U.S. predictability meant everything.
So in January 2024, GOL officially filed for Chapter 11 in the U.S. Now, it's important to remember, this isn't about liquidating the company or shutting it down. This is about hitting a giant reset button, getting protection from the courts to give them the time and space to rebuild the business from the ground up. And here's how that absolute priority rule actually plays out in the real world. You can see the pecking order clearly. The folks who provided that critical DIP financing and other senior debt, they get most of their money back. As you move down the chain of risk to other secured creditors, the recovery drops. And for unsecured creditors, it's a tiny fraction. The original shareholders, they're essentially wiped out. It's a harsh but clear system that rewards those who took the most recent risk to save the company.
So, the big question is, did it work? Oh yeah. The company went on a serious debt diet. Look at this. GOL went into bankruptcy with over $4.5 billion in debt. It's expected to come out with less than $2 billion. That is an enormous change. It finally gives the airline the financial breathing room it so desperately needed to get back in the air and compete.
So GLL made it through its own perfect storm. But the turbulence in the Brazilian airline market is far from over. In fact, its main rival, Azul, just recently filed for its own bankruptcy, facing many of the very same pressures. So now the big talk in the industry is a potential merger between the two. And that leaves us with one final massive question. Would combining these two battered survivors create a new, stronger Brazilian mega airline? Or would it just create one giant company with the same old problems? The next chapter of Brazilian aviation is still waiting to be written.